Chapter 7 on Free Immigration and Forced Integration. 1. The classical argument in favor of free immigration runs as follows. Other things being equal, businesses go to low-wage areas and labour moves to high-wage areas, thus affecting a tendency toward the equalization of wage rate for the same kind of labour, as well as the optimal localization of capital. An influx of migrants into a given-sized high-wage area will lower nominal wage rates. However, it will not lower real wage rates if the population is below its optimum size. To the contrary, if this is the case, the produced output will increase over-proportionally and real incomes will actually rise. Thus, restrictions on immigration will harm the protected domestic workers qua consumers more than they gain qua producers. Moreover, immigration restrictions will increase the flight of capital abroad, the export of capital which otherwise might have stayed, still causing an equalization of wage rates, although somewhat more slowly, but leading to a less than optimal allocation of capital, thereby harming world living standards all around. The law of migration and location, explains Ludwig von Mises, makes it possible for us to form an exact concept of relative overpopulation. The world, or an isolated country from which emigration is impossible, is to be regarded as overpopulated in the absolute sense when the optimum of population, that point beyond which an increase in the number of people would mean not an increase but a decrease in welfare, is exceeded. A country is relatively overpopulated where, because of the large size of the population, work must go on under less favourable conditions of production than in other countries, so that, ceteris paribus, the same application of capital and labour yields a smaller output there. With complete mobility of persons and goods, relatively overpopulated territories would give up their population surplus to other territories until this disproportion had disappeared. End quote. In addition, traditionally, labour unions and nowadays environmentalists are opposed to free immigration, and this should, prima facie, count as another argument in favour of a policy of free immigration. 2. As it is stated, the above argument in favour of free immigration is irrefutable. It would be foolish to attack it, just as it would be foolish to deny that free trade leads to higher living standards than does protectionism. It would also be wrong to attack the above case for free immigration by pointing out that because of the existence of a welfare state, immigration has become, to a significant extent, the immigration of welfare bums who do not increase but rather decrease average living standards, even if the United States, for instance, is below her optimal population point. For this is not an argument against immigration, but against the welfare state. To be sure, the welfare state should be destroyed in its entirety. However, the problems of immigration and welfare are analytically distinct problems and must be treated accordingly. The problem with the above argument is that it suffers from two interrelated shortcomings, which invalidate its unconditional pro-immigration conclusion and/or which render the argument applicable only to a highly unrealistic, long-bygone situation in human history. The first shortcoming will only be touched upon. To libertarians of the Austrian school, it should be clear that what constitutes wealth and well-being is subjective. Material wealth is not the only thing that has value. Thus, even if real incomes rise due to immigration, it does not follow that immigration must be considered good, for one might prefer lower living standards and a greater distance to other people over higher living standards and a smaller distance to others. Instead, a second, related shortcoming will be the focus here. With regard to a given territory into which people immigrate, it is left unanalyzed who, if anyone owns, controls this territory. In fact, in order to render the above argument applicable, it is implicitly assumed that the territory in question is unowned and that the immigrants enter virgin territory, open frontier. Obviously, today this can no longer be assumed. If this assumption is dropped, however, the problem of immigration takes on an entirely new meaning and requires fundamental rethinking. 3. For the purpose of illustration, let us first assume an anarcho-capitalist society. Though convinced that such a society is the only social order that can be defended as just, I do not want to explain here why this is the case. Instead, I will employ it as a conceptual benchmark, because this will help explain the fundamental misconception of most contemporary free immigration advocates. All land is privately owned, including all streets, rivers, airports, harbours, and so on. With respect to some pieces of land, the property title may be unrestricted, that is, the owner is permitted to do with his property whatever he pleases, as long as he does not physically damage the property owned by others. With respect to other territories, the property title may be more or less severely restricted. As is currently the case in some housing developments, the owner may be bound by contractual limitations on what he can do with his property. Voluntary zoning, which might include residential versus commercial use, no buildings more than 4 stories high, no sale or rent to Jews, Germans, Catholics, homosexuals, Haitians, families with or without children, or smokers, for example. Clearly, under this scenario, no such thing as freedom of immigration exists. Rather, many independent private property owners have the freedom to admit or exclude others from their own property in accordance with their own unrestricted or restricted property titles. Admission to some territories might be easy, but it might be nearly impossible to others. In any case, however, admission to the property of the admitting person does not imply a freedom to move around unless other property owners consent to such movement. There will be as much immigration or non-immigration, inclusivity or exclusivity, desegregation or segregation, non-discrimination or discrimination based on racial, ethnic, linguistic, religious, cultural, or whatever other grounds as individual owners or associations of individual owners allow. Note that none of this, not even the most exclusive form of segregationism, has anything to do with the rejection of free trade and the adoption of protectionism. From the fact that one does not want to associate with or live in the neighborhood of blacks, Turks, Catholics or Hindus, etc., it does not follow that one does not want to trade with them from a distance. As Ludwig von Mises reminds us, quote, even if such a thing as a natural and inborn hatred between various races existed, it would not render social cooperation futile. Social cooperation has nothing to do with personal love or with the general commandment to love one another. People do not cooperate under the division of labor because they love or should love one another. They cooperate because this best serves their own interests. Neither love nor charity, nor any other sympathetic sentiments but rightly understood selfishness is what originally impelled man to adjust himself to the requirements of society, to respect the rights and freedoms of his fellow men, and to substitute peaceful collaboration for enmity and conflict." End quote. To the contrary, it is precisely the absolute voluntariness of human association and separation, the absence of any form of forced integration, that makes peaceful relationships, free trade between culturally, racially, ethnically, or religiously distinct people possible. Contrary to the currently fashionable multiculturalism, it might be pointed out that no multicultural society, and especially no democratic one, has ever worked peacefully for very long. Peter Brimelow, in Alien Nation, Common Sense About America's Immigration Disaster, has provided some recent evidence to this effect. Working back from the present, look at the record. Eritrea, ruled by Ethiopia since 1952, splits off in 1993. Czechoslovakia, founded in 1918, splits into Czech and Slovak ethnic components in 1993. Soviet Union splits into multiple ethnic components in 1991, and many of these components are threatened with further ethnic fragmentation. Yugoslavia, founded in 1918, splits into several ethnic components in 1991, and further breakup is still underway. Lebanon, founded 1920, effective partition of Christians and Muslims under Syrian domination since 1975. Cyprus, independent since 1960, effective partition of Greek and Turkish territories in 1974. Pakistan, independent since 1947, ethnically distinct Bangladesh splits off in 1971. Malaysia, independent since 1963, Chinese-dominated Singapore is expelled in 1965. The list goes on with cases which have not yet been resolved. India and the Sikhs and Kashmirs, Sri Lanka and the Tamils, Turkey, Iraq, Iran and the Kurds, Sudan, Chad and the Arabs versus blacks, Nigeria and the Ibos, Ulster and the Catholics versus the Protestants, Belgium and the Flemish versus the Walloons, Italy and the German-speaking South Tyroleans, Canada and the French versus the English. But is not Switzerland, with an assembly of Germans, French, Italians and Romans, an exception? Put briefly, the answer is no. All essential powers in Switzerland, in particular that of determining cultural and educational matters, schools, are concentrated in the hands of the cantons rather than those of the central government, and almost all of the 26 cantons and half-cantons are ethnically homogeneous. 17 cantons are almost exclusively German, 4 cantons are almost exclusively French, and 1 canton is predominantly Italian. Only 3 cantons are bilingual, the Swiss ethnic balance has been essentially stable, and there is only a limited amount of intercantonal migration. Even given these favourable circumstances, Switzerland did experience an unsuccessful, violently suppressed war of secession, the Sonderbundskrieg of 1847. Furthermore, the creation of the new breakaway French-speaking canton of Jura from the predominantly German canton of Bern in 1979 was preceded by years of terrorist activity. 4. In an anarcho-capitalist society, there is no government and, accordingly, no clear-cut distinction between inlanders, domestic citizens, and foreigners. This distinction only arises with the establishment of a government, that is, an institution which possesses a territorial monopoly of aggression, taxation. The territory over which a government's taxing power extends becomes inland, and everyone residing outside of this territory becomes a foreigner. State borders and passports are an unnatural, coercive institution. Indeed, their existence and that of a domestic government implies a twofold distortion with respect to people's natural inclination to associate with others. First, inlanders cannot exclude the government, the taxman, from their own property, and are subject to what one might call forced integration by government agents. Second, in order to be able to intrude on its subjects' private property so as to tax them, a government must invariably have control of existing roads, and it will employ its tax revenue to produce even more roads to gain even better access to all private property qua potential tax source. This overproduction of roads does not result merely in the innocent facilitation of interregional trade, a lowering of transaction costs, as starry-eyed economists would have us believe, but leads to forced domestic integration, artificial desegregation of separate localities. In fact, as noted by Max Weber, Soziologie, Weltgeschichtliche Analysen, Politik, the famed roadways of ancient Rome were typically regarded as a plague rather than an advantage, because they were essentially military rather than trade routes. Moreover, with the establishment of a government and state borders, immigration takes on an entirely new meaning. Immigration becomes immigration by foreigners across state borders, and the decision as to whether or not a person should be admitted no longer rests with private property owners or associations of such owners, but with the government as the ultimate sovereign of all domestic residents and the ultimate super-owner of all their properties. Now, if the government excludes a person while even one domestic resident wants to admit this very person onto his property, the result is forced exclusion, a phenomenon that does not exist under private property anarchism. Furthermore, if the government admits a person while there is not a single domestic resident who wants to have this person on his property, the result is forced integration, also non-existent under private property anarchism. 5. It is time to enrich the analysis through the introduction of a few realistic empirical assumptions. Let us assume that the government is privately owned. The ruler owns the entire country within state borders. He owns part of the territory outright, his property title is unrestricted, and he is partial owner of the rest as landlord or residual claimant of all of his citizen tenants' real estate holdings, albeit restricted by some pre-existing rental contracts. He can sell and bequeath his property, and he can calculate and capture the monetary value of his capital, his country. Traditional monarchies and kings are the closest historical examples of this form of government. What will a king's typical immigration and emigration policy be? Because he owns the entire country's capital value, he will tend to choose migration policies that preserve or enhance rather than diminish the value of his kingdom, assuming no more than his self-interest. As far as emigration is concerned, a king would want to prevent the emigration of productive subjects, in particular of his best and most productive subjects, because losing them would lower the value of the kingdom. Thus, for example, from 1782 until 1824, a law prohibited the emigration of skilled workmen from Britain. On the other hand, a king would want to expel his non-productive and destructive subjects, criminals, bums, beggars, gypsies, vagabonds, etc., for their removal from his territory would increase the value of his realm. For this reason, Britain expelled tens of thousands of common criminals to North America and Australia. On the other hand, as far as immigration policies are concerned, a king would want to keep the mob, as well as all people of inferior productive capabilities, out. People of the latter category would only be admitted temporarily as seasonal workers without citizenship, and they would be barred from permanent property ownership. Thus, for example, after 1880, large numbers of Poles were hired as seasonal workers in Germany. A king would only permit the permanent immigration of superior or at least above average people, that is, those whose residence in his kingdom would increase his own property value. Thus, for example, after 1685, with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, tens of thousands of Huguenots were permitted to settle in Prussia, and similarly, Peter the Great, Frederick the Great, and Maria Theresa later promoted the immigration and settlement of large numbers of Germans in Russia, Prussia, and the eastern provinces of Austria-Hungary. The settlement of Germans in Eastern Europe actually began in the 11th century and was generally encouraged by various regional Slavic kings and princes who thereby hoped to promote the economic development of their realms. A highly illuminating account of the social effects and repercussions of these migration policies in the multicultural Habsburg Empire is provided by Mises in Nation, State, and Economy. Quote, as a result of centuries-long colonization, the urban bourgeoisie and the urban intelligentsia were German everywhere in Austria and Hungary. Large land ownership was in great part Germanized, and everywhere, even in the middle of foreign language territory, there were German peasant settlements. All of Austria outwardly bore a German stamp. Everywhere, German education and German literature were to be found. Everywhere in the empire, the Germans were also represented among the petty bourgeoisie, among the workers, and among the peasants, even though in many districts, especially in Galicia, in many parts of Hungary, and in the coastal territories, the German minority among the members of the lower strata of the population was quite small. But in the entire empire, Upper Italy excepted, the percentage of Germans among the educated and among the members of the higher strata was quite considerable, and all those educated persons and prosperous bourgeois who were not themselves German and did not want to acknowledge belonging to the German nation were German by their education, spoke German, read German, and appeared at least outwardly to be German. Thus, Austria no doubt was not German, but politically it wore a German face. Every Austrian who wanted to take any interest at all in public affairs had to master the German language. For the members of the Czech and of the Slovene peoples, however, education and social ascent could be achieved only through Germanness. They still had no literature of their own that would have made it possible for them to do without the treasures of German culture. Whoever rose became German because precisely the members of the higher strata were German. The Germans saw that and believed that it had to be so. They were far from wanting to Germanize all non-Germans compulsorily, but they thought that this would take place on its own. They believed that every Czech and South Slav would try, even in his own interest, to adopt German culture. In brief, while through his immigration policies a king might not entirely avoid all cases of forced exclusion or forced integration, such policies would by and large do the same as what private property owners would do, if they could decide whom to admit and whom to exclude. That is, the king would be highly selective and very much concerned about improving the quality of the resident human capital so as to drive property values up rather than down. 6. Migration policies become predictably different once the government is publicly owned. The ruler no longer owns the country's capital value, but only has current use of it. He cannot sell or bequeath his position as ruler. He is merely a temporary caretaker. Moreover, free entry into the position of a caretaker government exists. In principle, anyone can become the ruler of the country. As they came into existence on a worldwide scale after World War I, democracies offer historical examples of public government. What are a democracy's migration policies? Once again assuming no more than self-interest, maximizing monetary and psychic income, money and power, democratic rulers tend to maximize current income, which they can appropriate privately at the expense of capital values, which they cannot appropriate privately. Hence, in accordance with democracy's inherent egalitarianism of one man, one vote, they tend to pursue a distinctly egalitarian, non-discriminatory emigration and immigration policy. As far as immigration policy is concerned, this implies that for a democratic ruler, it makes little, if any, difference whether productive or unproductive people, geniuses or bums, leave the country. They all have one equal vote. In fact, democratic rulers might well be more concerned about the loss of a bum than that of a productive genius. While the loss of the latter would obviously lower the capital value of the country and loss of the former might actually increase it, a democratic ruler does not own the country. In the short run, which is of the most interest to a democratic ruler, the bum, voting most likely in favor of egalitarian measures, might be more valuable than the productive genius who, as egalitarianism's prime victim, will more likely vote against the democratic ruler. To avoid any misunderstanding, it should be emphasized here that the difference between monarchical and democratic republican government with respect to emigration policy is not one of restrictive versus unrestricted emigration. In fact, the most severe restrictions on emigration were imposed in the 20th century by the so-called Socialist People's Republics of Eastern Europe. Rather, the difference is one concerning the type of restrictions, respectively the motivation underlying such restrictions. Thus, whereas monarchical immigration restrictions were typically motivated by economic concerns, democratic republican restrictions are typically motivated by power concerns, with the most frequent restriction being that one may not emigrate until one has fulfilled one's compulsory military service. For the same reason, quite unlike a king, a democratic ruler undertakes little to actively expel those people whose presence within the country constitutes a negative externality, human trash which drives individual property values down. In fact, such negative externalities, unproductive parasites, bums and criminals, are likely to be his most reliable supporters. As far as immigration policies are concerned, the incentives and disincentives are likewise distorted and the results are equally perverse. For a democratic ruler, it also matters little whether bums or geniuses, below or above average, civilized and productive people immigrate into the country, nor is he much concerned about the distinction between temporary workers, owners of work permits, and permanent, property-owning immigrants, naturalized citizens. Of all major European countries, it has been France, the country with the longest democratic republican tradition, which has boasted the most liberal, that is, least restrictive, immigration and naturalization policy. In fact, bums and unproductive people may well be preferred as residents and citizens because they create more so-called social problems, and democratic rulers thrive on the existence of such problems. Moreover, bums and inferior people will likely support his egalitarian policies, whereas geniuses and superior people will not. The result of this policy of non-discrimination is forced integration, the forcing of masses of inferior immigrants onto domestic property owners who, if the decision were left to them, would have sharply discriminated and chosen very different neighbours for themselves. Thus, as the best available example of democracy at work, the United States immigration laws of 1965 eliminated all previous quality concerns and the explicit preference for European immigrants, replacing them with a policy of almost complete non-discrimination, multiculturalism. To put matters into perspective, Brimlow, in Alien Nation, documents that from 1820 until 1967, when the new immigration laws went into effect, almost 90% of all immigrants were of European descent. In contrast, from 1967 until 1993, some 85% of the close to 17 million legal immigrants arriving in the US came from the Third World, mostly Latin America and Asia. Rather than selection by skill and job qualification as before 1967, the primary selection criteria currently are family reunification, asylum, and diversity lottery. Consequently, the average level of education and the average wage rate of immigrants has continually fallen as compared to their Native American counterparts. Moreover, the welfare participation rate of immigrant households significantly exceeds, and increasingly so, that of the native population, which includes blacks and Puerto Ricans with an already extremely high welfare participation rate. For instance, the welfare participation rate of Cambodian and Laotian immigrants is almost 50%, that of Vietnamese immigrants is above 25%, Dominican Republic 28%, Cuba 16%, former Soviet Union 16%, China 10%. As well, immigrants remain on the dole for increasingly longer periods. Last but not least, Brimlow estimates that if the current trends of legal as well as illegal immigration continue, the population of European descent, which has traditionally made up close to 90% of the US population, will be on the verge of becoming a minority by the year 2050. But won't all of the immigrants be assimilated and become Americans? Not likely, because in order to be successfully assimilated, the influx of immigrants needs to be small in comparison to the host population. However, the current influx of about 1 million legal immigrants and 200,000 to 300,000 illegal immigrants per year is concentrated in just a few regions: California, Texas, Illinois, Florida, New York, and New Jersey. And most immigrants actually move to just 6 metropolitan areas: Los Angeles, Anaheim, Chicago, Miami, New York, and Washington, D.C. In these regions, the number of immigrants is proportionally so large that any assimilation is essentially out of the question. Rather than gradually being Americanized then, in these areas immigrants have established foreign Third World countries on formerly American soil. George Borjas notes further that almost a quarter of immigrant households received some type of assistance compared to 15% of native households. What's more, the use of public assistance by immigrants increases over time. It seems that assimilation involves learning not only about labor market opportunities, but also about the opportunities provided by the welfare state. A study by the National Academy of Sciences concluded that immigration in fact raised the taxes of the typical native household in California by about $1,200 per year. As for refugees in particular, the evidence indicates that, after 10 years in the United States, 16% of Vietnamese refugees, 24% of Cambodian refugees, and 34% of Laotian refugees were still receiving public assistance. Moreover, Borjas emphasizes, quote, ethnicity matters in economic life, and it matters for a very long time. That is, the increasingly high skill differential between the native and the immigrant population does not quickly disappear as the result of cultural assimilation. Instead, immigrants typically move to ethnic ghettos, which incubate ethnic differences, and thus ethnic skill differentials may persist for 3 generations. End quote. Indeed, the immigration policy of a democracy is the mirror image of its policy toward internal population movement, to the voluntary association and dissociation, segregation and desegregation, and the physical distancing and approximating of various private property owners. Like a king, a democratic ruler promotes spatial over-integration by overproducing the public good of roads. However, for a democratic ruler unlike a king, it will not be sufficient that everyone can move next door to anyone else on government roads. Concerned about his current income and power rather than capital values and constrained by egalitarian sentiments, a democratic ruler will tend to go even further. Through non-discrimination laws, one cannot discriminate against Germans, Jews, blacks, Catholics, Hindus, homosexuals, etc. The government will want to increase the physical access and entrance to everyone's property to everyone else. Thus it is hardly surprising that the so-called civil rights legislation in the United States, which outlawed domestic discrimination on the basis of color, race, national origin, religion, gender, age, sexual orientation, disability, etc., and which thereby actually mandated forced integration, coincided with the adoption of a non-discriminatory immigration policy, that is, mandated international desegregation, forced integration. 7. The current situation in the United States and in Western Europe has nothing whatsoever to do with free immigration. It is forced integration, plain and simple, and forced integration is the predictable outcome of democratic one-man, one-vote rule. Abolishing forced integration requires the de-democratization of society and ultimately the abolition of democracy. More specifically, the power to admit or exclude should be stripped from the hands of the central government and reassigned to the states, provinces, cities, towns, villages, residential districts, and ultimately to private property owners and their voluntary associations. Until a U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1875, the regulation of immigration into the United States was considered a state rather than a federal matter. The means to achieve this goal are decentralization and secession, both inherently undemocratic and anti-majoritarian. One would be well on the way toward the restoration of the freedom of association and exclusion, as is implied in the idea and institution of private property, and much of the social strife currently caused by forced integration would disappear if only towns and villages could and would do what they did as a matter of course until well into the 19th century in Europe and the United States, to post signs regarding entrance requirements to the town, and once in town, for entering specific pieces of property, no beggars, bums or homeless, but also no Muslims, Hindus, Jews, Catholics, etc., to expel as trespassers those who do not fulfill these requirements, and to solve the naturalization question somewhat along the Swiss model, where local assemblies, not the central government, determine who can and who cannot become a Swiss citizen. What should one advocate as the relatively correct immigration policy, however, as long as the democratic central state is still in place and successfully arrogates the power to determine a uniform national immigration policy? The best one may hope for, even if it goes against the nature of a democracy and thus is not very likely to happen, is that the democratic rulers act as if they were the personal owners of the country and as if they had to decide who to include and who to exclude from their own personal property into their very own houses. This means following a policy of the strictest discrimination in favor of the human qualities of skill, character, and cultural compatibility. More specifically, it means distinguishing strictly between citizens, naturalized immigrants, and resident aliens, and excluding the latter from all welfare entitlements. It means requiring for resident alien status, as well as for citizenship, the personal sponsorship by a resident citizen and his assumption of liability for all property damage caused by the immigrant. It implies requiring an existing employment contract with a resident citizen. Moreover, for both categories, but especially that of citizenship, it implies that all immigrants must demonstrate through tests not only English language proficiency, but all-around superior, above-average intellectual performance and character structure, as well as a compatible system of values, with the predictable result of a systematic pro-European immigration bias. Currently, about 1/2 of the U.S. foreign-born citizens, after more than 5 years of presence in the United States, still speak virtually no English. Of the largest immigrant group, Hispanics, well above 2/3 speak practically no English. Their level of intellectual performance is significantly below the U.S. average, and growing evidence indicates that the crime rate of the immigrant population systematically exceeds that of the native-born population.